Hi, everyone. I've been honored and privileged to speak every year at these prevention conferences since the beginning in 2021. And many of you know my story by now, so I may only be just sharing updates with you today. So first, I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that there's a growing community of people that are genetically at risk for adult onset neurodegenerative diseases. And we started to talk with one another. And one thing that we observed was that while sometimes opinions are sought from people with lived experience of disease, meaning people that have diagnosis of a manifest condition or caregivers, people at risk are not always recognized as a separate additional set of stakeholders. And especially now that we're talking about definitions and staging and classifications, you must include the voice of people at high risk in those conversations. We are doing that here at this conference, but we need to influence our influence more broadly. One of the problems, though, is that the at-risk community for Parkinson's is not very well organized or connected yet. As I shared at the last conference, my 21-year-old son, Carson, we know is also a LRRK2 G2019S carrier and has participated in research with me. But we personally don't know anyone else like us. So I asked the director of End the Legacy, and I said, how do you find other people like you that are at risk for ALS and frontotemporal dementia? And her advice to me was just to start with a simple website. So that is what I did. I created linktolark2.com very recently, and it's really nothing fancy. It's just a way to tell my story and to hopefully give people a way to contact me, to find others to connect like me and to connect with researchers and clinicians that have an interest in LRRK2. And so the other major update that I wanted to talk about was my SIN1 skin biopsy test late last year. I have been asking my neurologist for this test for the last 2 years, and I finally convinced him to order it for me. I actually became the first person in the clinic to have the skin biopsy as a clinical test. They had done them as research studies, but they've never actually ordered it clinically before. So why did I want this test done? Well, I feel like people that have pathologic variants in LRRK2 and GBA, we seem to be dismissed as not particularly relevant because of the lower penetrance. And I felt like I needed to convince others that I deserved a seat at the table too. Yet I'm fully aware that there are many, many people with LRRK2 PD that have no alpha-synuclein abnormality. So I knew that a negative SIN1 test wasn't going to tell me anything. However, I knew that this particular alpha-synuclein test was clinically available, and I felt like a positive test would mean something. But I do feel like that it's critical that we do incorporate additional biomarkers for other relevant pathways like neuroinflammation or mitochondrial dysfunction or lysosomal dysfunction. And I think it's important. I think it's amazing that we have that alpha-synuclein tests, but I think we need to combine them with other biomarkers. So the conversation with my movement disorder specialist went something like this. He said, you obviously have anxiety if you're asking to have this biomarker test. An abnormal result might make you even more worried, and it cannot predict Parkinson's. Many people with LRRK2 PD are negative. And I said something like, well, it bothers me to not have access to information about my own body. Many people dismiss me as not having a high likelihood of developing Parkinson's, and I disagree. I want to be seen, and I want to be heard, and I want to qualify for interventional trials. So I ultimately had the test done, and lo and behold, the results were indeed abnormal. And right in the middle of the biopsy sites on my thigh, which is interesting too. And I wasn't surprised about the reduced nerve fiber density. I do have symptoms of neuropathy, although mostly in my left leg, and the skin biopsy was on my right leg. And I'm personally really curious to know if these results change or they get worse or they go to different biopsy sites, and if my left side will show different results from my right side. And I found it all very, very fascinating and intriguing. But when the results came back, there was a big difference in my reaction and my movement disorder specialist reaction. My doctor was very, very conflicted with the results. And he said something like, "See, this is why you shouldn't have had the test done. I have no answers to give you. This could be an incidental, benign finding. You could still never get Parkinson's disease, and it's all very confusing." On the other hand, my reaction was admittedly a little bit smug because I wasn't really that surprised. And I reacted something like, "See, I told you so. I'm very glad I asked to have this test done. We never would have known otherwise. And it is very interesting, even more so if I never develop Parkinson's in my lifetime. And we won't have the answers unless we test and study people like me." And I found it very, very curious that overall it was my neurologist that felt very uncomfortable. But I felt fine. In fact, I felt better having this information, even if it was abnormal. And just really quickly, a lot of people have asked me, a lot of people are curious about how much it cost me to have the test. And so I know it's going to be very different for each individual. Everybody has different insurance and experiences. I don't have Medicare. I know Medicare covers the test. I have Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield of Virginia, and they did approve the test. But C&D Life Sciences was deemed to be an out-of-network provider. So I ended up paying $367.55 out of pocket, and then I paid $30 copay for my neurologist office to actually perform the skin biopsy procedure. And personally, I felt like the cost to me was well worth the information that I received. So to summarize, I think it's essential to gain the perspective and feedback of people at high risk of being diagnosed with PD when developing prevention trials. And the perspectives of people with Parkinson's and caregivers are incredibly important, but that representation cannot take the place of those in the at-risk community. We may have a little bit different perspective. And secondly, objective biomarker results may help people at risk to feel like they are taken more seriously and to help us to feel validated regarding those early symptoms, especially those non-motor symptoms that we talked about, because we know that those occur many, many years before the motor symptoms occur. And research into additional biomarker pathways are critical. I'm actually more concerned about false negatives than I am about false positives. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that significant damage is not occurring. And finally, be careful not to confuse self-advocacy with anxiety. Engagement in one's own health and people seeking more detailed knowledge about their risks should be respected by clinicians and researchers. And honestly, overall, I'm very, very energized by the pace of the progress that we've had just since our last convention and our last conference. And I very much look forward to that progress continuing. Thank you.